Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Across State Lines. I'm your host, Danielle. Thank you so much for tuning into the podcast for episode 17, where today we will be discussing the 1960 case of Sharon Lee Gallegos, who was once formerly known as Little Miss Nobody before she was properly identified and her name was returned to her. 4-year-old Sharon was a very sweet and happy child who was growing up in New Mexico in the late 1950s. But by the early 1960s, Sharon's happy-go-lucky nature began to change, and she became very nervous and afraid much of the time. Neighbors, friends, and family began to notice that Sharon's newfound nervousness was because she was being stalked by a couple in their 30s, who would not only follow Sharon around town and keep an eye on her, but would also begin to pry neighbors for information about the little girl. In July of 1960, when the couple stalking Sharon saw their chance, they grabbed her and pulled her into their car, abducting her, and she was never seen again. 10 days later, the charred body of a small girl was discovered in the desert of Congress, Arizona, and the identity of this girl went unknown for 60 years, despite many attempts to try to discover who she actually was. This unknown child was given the name Little Miss Nobody and was buried by the community of Prescott, Arizona, in a small cemetery on a hill. In 2022, thanks to DNA profiling, Little Miss Nobody was properly identified as Sharon Lee Gallegos, but sadly, her killers have never been identified and found, despite many eyewitnesses to Sharon's abduction. But before we jump into the case, I want to remind everybody that Across State Lines is available on all podcast streaming platforms, such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and anywhere else that you might listen. If you are liking Across State Lines and would like to leave us a rating, a review, or a follow, it would be greatly appreciated. If you want to leave us any feedback, please go to our website and send us an email. Thank you so much for listening. And now, let's dive into the case of Sharon Lee Gallegos, formerly known as Little Miss Nobody. Sharon Lee Gallegos was born on September 6, 1955, in Alamogordo, New Mexico, and shared a home with her mother, siblings, grandmother, and 6 other relatives, which included 4 other children who were cousins to Sharon. Her father, who was a soldier, had left the family when Sharon was a baby, and she had no contact with him while growing up. Sharon's mother worked hard to provide for her family, having been employed as a housekeeper for a local motel, and often worked long shifts to make ends meet. The family was extremely close-knit, and it was said that Sharon loved growing up with the other children in her home and enjoyed playing with her siblings and young cousins. 4-year-old Sharon was described by her nephew, Ray Chavez, as a jovial, happy-go-lucky child with a feisty side to her. She loved to be helpful to her mother, often running little errands for her, such as going to the grocery store to pick up items that were needed in the home. Her family affectionately nicknamed Sharon La Güera due to her fair complexion and lighter hair, in contrast to her siblings and cousins. Ray stated that his mother, Vicky, who was 15 at the time of Sharon's disappearance, was like a little mother to Sharon, and the two were very close. In the weeks leading up to Sharon's kidnapping, her family noted that she began to withdraw from things that she normally loved to do, like those little trips to the grocery store for her mother and playing with her siblings and cousins. Investigators now know that this was because Sharon was being stalked during this time period, with a few strange occurrences having happened. On July 17, 1960, Sharon attended a church service with her mother, Guadalupe. In the parking lot of the church after the service, idly sat a green-colored sedan with 4 passengers inside, a man, a woman, and 2 younger children. The children were only described as one freckled-faced boy and a small girl. After people gathered outside the church, the woman from the green sedan was observed asking some of the people in the congregation probing questions about Sharon and her mother. As with the grocery store trips, Sharon's personality began to shift in other ways those last few weeks, with her mother stating that she became increasingly nervous and wary. Her family stated that she would become visibly upset whenever she would spot that same green sedan near her home or parked in the places that she was visiting. This car and its occupants scared her so much that she would often ask family members to pick her up and carry her anytime she needed to pass by this vehicle. 2 days after the church incident on July 19th, the same woman would knock on the neighbors' doors surrounding the family home. When she spoke with these neighbors, she had quite a few personal questions. She inquired about Guadalupe's actual address, how many children she had, specifically if she had a little girl, and Guadalupe's financial situation. This woman had asked these questions under the guise of intending to offer Guadalupe a well-paying job to provide for her children. On July 21st, around 3 p.m., Sharon was playing with her cousins in an alley located behind her home on Virginia Avenue. The same green sedan, which was believed to either be a dark green 1951 or 1952 Dodge or Plymouth, pulled up into the alleyway. In an attempt to persuade Sharon to enter their car, they offered to buy her new clothing and some candy, but Sharon refused. Once the abductors knew that Sharon wouldn't go with them willingly, the woman exited the car, grabbed her by the arm, and dragged her into the vehicle, shutting the door behind her. The sedan quickly drove off and was last seen turning left, speeding onto 5th Street. The female abductor was described as a short, heavy-set woman in her 30s, with blonde hair and glasses. The male abductor was described as thin, with a fair complexion, a long nose, and straight, sandy brown hair. The other children who bore witness to the abduction ran back to their home and informed the adults about what had just taken place. The family immediately called the cops, who wasted no time. Authorities set up roadblocks at the Texas-New Mexico border, where they searched any vehicle matching the description of the sedan that the abductors were seen driving. Sadly, the suspects wouldn't be heading east into Texas, but rather west into Arizona, a fact that no one would know for over 60 years. The investigators attempted to piece the situation together, trying to establish a motive for the kidnapping. A ransom demand was quickly ruled out due to the family's financial status and how the woman abductor already inquired into that with the neighbors. The fact that Sharon had been stalked for weeks prior to the kidnapping led authorities to theorize that she most likely had been targeted, and the abductors were biding their time, waiting for the perfect opportunity to abduct her. Witnesses, family, and neighbors were all promptly questioned as well. One of Sharon's 11-year-old cousins, who was a witness to the crime, was adamant that she had seen that same vehicle parked near the Gallegos' home shortly before the abduction, watching the children playing outside. She also recounts how her and Sharon had walked directly in front of the car on their walk to the grocery store that afternoon. The 11-year-old said that the woman inside the sedan was staring intently at the girls' shared home, and this had upset Sharon so much that she again asked to be carried by her older cousin. A neighbor of the family, Helen Gonzalez, also recalled having seen the vehicle parked outside the home the Sunday prior to the kidnapping. Despite these recollections and the description of the suspects, on July 28th, officers announced that they more or less chalked the abduction up to a relative or a possible acquaintance, which was completely against the evidence that was before them. On July 31st, 1960, a Las Vegas schoolteacher named Russell Allen was out in the desert searching for rocks that he hoped to use to decorate his garden. He was searching near Sand Wash Creek on Old Alamo Road in Congress, Arizona, when he stumbled upon the partially burned remains of a young female child. The body had been dressed in red shorts, a button-up blue blouse, and a pair of adult-sized flip-flops that had been cut to fit the feet of a child, with leather straps to secure them. Other articles of children's clothing were found buried within the shallow grave as well. In addition, the child's fingernails and toenails had also been painted a bright red color. The body was removed by the crime scene investigations unit and brought to the Widmer Funeral Home to undergo an autopsy to find out the cause of death. Investigators had noticed that there had been 2 separate attempts to dig a grave to bury the girl. They had determined this because there were sections of disturbed dirt near the final resting place of the little girl. They also determined through tire impressions that the car had driven off of Highway 93 to the burial site before turning around again and driving away from it. 2 sets of footprints were also found in the desert sand, one of an adult and the other of the child, who they believe had walked to the site of her own murder. A rusty, blood-stained pocket knife was also found nearby, and the knife, clothing, and footprint impressions would all be sent to the FBI for further testing. However, it was never determined if this knife was actually used in the murder or if it had been left there by someone else and had no relation to the crime. The autopsy determined that the young girl, who was described as being between 5 to 7 years old and weighing between 50 to 60 pounds, had been dead for about 1 to 2 weeks prior to her discovery. The body had a full, intact set of milk teeth that had been reported to be in good condition. They noted that her hair had also been tinted an auburn shade, perhaps as a way to hide her identity. They were unable to conclude a manner of death, but stated that the child had not suffered any puncture wounds, nor broken or fractured any bones. Despite not coming to a conclusion on the manner of death, they did classify it as a homicide, as the remains had been set on fire and badly charred. A more recent autopsy concluded that her body had been charred at or around the time of her death, and that there had been no puncture holes in the clothing that the body was dressed in. A composite sketch was unable to be drawn up at the time due to the state of decomposition of the body. Soon, the moniker Jane Doe would be changed to Little Miss Nobody, a sad nickname to use as a placeholder until they could identify the body. The FBI and Yavapai County officials got to work, along with private citizens and the local media, and an APB was immediately sent out about the body they had discovered. Many sex offenders in the area who had previously assaulted children were spoken to at length, but this didn't seem to bring investigators any closer to the identity of Little Miss Nobody. In addition, numerous phone calls, letters, and telegrams providing tips flooded the police station and FBI headquarters with names of missing little girls who Little Miss Nobody could be, and every lead that could be followed was thoroughly investigated, with no luck. Through talking with people in the area where the body was found, they learned that witnesses had seen a family walking near the area around July 27th, with a young girl seen to be wearing very similar clothing that had matched the description of what the body was wearing, along with similar sandals. This led investigators to believe that the deceased child may have belonged to this family, and that the family may have been transients. With further probing of the eyewitnesses that had seen the transient family that day, a family with the last name of Davidson came under the spotlight as a possible family near the area the day that the body was found. The Davidsons had been questioned, and it was determined that they had been hitchhiking near Prescott at the end of July, which was only slightly further north than Congress, and there had also been a confirmed sighting of the Davidson family in Alamogordo on the day that Sharon had been abducted. However, despite these coincidences, police concluded that the Davidsons had nothing to do with either the disappearance of Sharon or with the murder of the little girl found in the desert, and once their alibis were verified, they were free to go. Initially, the investigators had considered Sharon to be Little Miss Nobody, due to her age as well as the date and proximity of the crime. A Yavapai County officer went on record publicly saying that the little girl could in fact be Sharon. Investigators had considered the fact that the body was not dressed in the same clothing that Sharon was abducted in, but assumed that within the 10 days of Sharon being missing and the deceased child being found, that the clothing could have been and most likely had been changed. They also considered the fact that Sharon's abduction was over 400 miles away from the burial site, but once again worked around this due to the fact that 10 days had passed between the abduction and the murder. However, in the end, they would eventually rule her out when they revised the age of Little Miss Nobody to around 7 years old, determining that Sharon was far too young to have matched the body. As the years passed, authorities were still working on the case of Little Miss Nobody, but they kept running into dead ends. In 1961, they had considered that Little Miss Nobody may have been missing 4-year-old Deborah Jane Dudley, who had gone missing out of Virginia. Deborah and her 4 siblings had all gone missing in the late 1950s and early 1960s, and the age of Deborah matched the presumed age of Little Miss Nobody. Sadly, however, Deborah's little sister, Carol Ann, would be discovered on February 9, 1961, wrapped in a blanket in Virginia, and she had died from malnutrition, exposure, and neglect at the hands of her parents. Deborah's brother, Claude Arthur Dudley, had died at the age of 3 on November 17, 1958, and had been left in a wash pit in Florida, also at the hands of his parents. Deborah's brothers Norman James Dudley, who was 10, and Charles Augustus Dudley, who was 8, both died on Christmas Day in 1959 near Phoenix, Arizona. Their parents drove their bodies to New Orleans and weighted them down and disposed of them in a lake on January 1st, 1960. And Deborah had been found discarded in a patch of woods later in 1961 in Virginia, officially ruling Deborah out as Little Miss Nobody. She was interred next to her sister, and the parents of the 5 children were charged with 5 counts of murder. In the hopes of producing fresh leads in the case of Little Miss Nobody, on August 8, 1961, Yavapai County Sheriff Jim Kramer, along with other law enforcement officers and news camera crews, made the hike to the area where the body was found. Standing in front of the cameras, Kramer showed the evidence found at the scene to the media, including the adult-sized sandals that had been cut in half to fit the child's feet, and stated, quote, "Somewhere, there is someone who has the answer that we have been looking for. Maybe this will be the thing that will bring the person forward." End quote. But sadly, once again, this produced no leads in the case of the deceased child, and the case quickly went cold for decades. On August 10, 1960, Little Miss Nobody was laid to rest in Mountain View Cemetery in Prescott, Arizona, and a funeral was held in her honor with 70 people in attendance. A placard was placed on her small, pale blue coffin, which read, "God's little child, date of birth unknown, date of death unknown." At her funeral, a man named Dr. Parker recited a poem for her, which read, quote, "Here is a little wanderer who has been in our midst. We don't know her name. We can only guess her age. It occurs to me we may not know, but God knows. There are no unknowns, no orphans in God's world. She doesn't need a name today. She has the name of an angel somewhere in eternity. We may never know the whys and the wherefores, but somewhere, someone is going to be watching the paper to learn what happened to the little girl left in the desert. If there has been a misdeed, probably a disquieted conscience will go on and on." End quote. A local talk radio host, David Paladin, was adamant that the child was not to be buried in a pauper's grave, and wanting to give her a more dignified resting place, he put on a campaign to raise money in order to bury her in Mountain View. Paladin stated to the media that he had put the campaign on because the idea of the little girl being buried in Boot Hill was an insufferable thought to him, and he wanted to give her a Christian burial. That is where Little Miss Nobody remained for 60 decades. Since technology has rapidly advanced since the time of the discovery of the remains, the decision to exhume the body of Little Miss Nobody was made in 2018. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children paid to have this done, as well as for further testing. Getting a full DNA sample from the body of Little Miss Nobody was successful, and the labs determined through those DNA samples that the highest possible age for the child was between 3 to 6 years old, once again ruling in Sharon Gallegos. A composite sketch of the child was created by the University of Texas as well, before her body was reburied in its plot in Prescott, Arizona. In January of 2022, Samples of the DNA was sent to Othram Inc. in order to see if they could determine a family tree or living relatives of Little Miss Nobody. And finally, on March 15th, 2022, Yavapai County officers held a press conference to release the official name of Little Miss Nobody, who was positively identified as being Sharon Lee Gallegos. Officials wanted to make it clear of their hopes that no one would again refer to Sharon as her moniker, saying, quote, "The unidentified little girl who won the hearts of Yavapai County in 1960 and who occupied the minds and time of our sheriff's office and partners for 62 years will now rightfully be given her name back." End quote. Officers are now working on the next part of their investigation, identifying the man and woman who abducted and murdered Sharon that summer day. They are currently trying to piece together the exact chain of events that occurred over the 10 days between the abduction and the discovery of the remains. If the suspects are still alive today, they would most likely be in their 90s. When Little Miss Nobody was first laid to rest, the town gave her a headstone that read, quote, "Little Miss Nobody, blessed are the pure of heart." Matthew 5:2, 1960. When Little Miss Nobody was determined to be Sharon Lee Gallegos, I stopped by the Mountain View Cemetery to lay flowers at her grave. But, despite my best efforts, I couldn't find the location of her burial plot within the large cemetery grounds, and left the flowers at another grave, despite not knowing who they were. However, I did recently learn that Sharon was exhumed and brought back to New Mexico to lay beside her mother, Guadalupe. After 64 years apart, they are finally reunited and will rest beside one another for eternity. Sharon's headstone now reflects her true name, much like in the case of Valentine Sally, who was identified as Carolyn Celeste Eaton, who is the subject of episode 16 on the podcast. In Carolyn's case, I spoke to Patty Wilkins on the phone, and she informed me that the remaining family didn't want to bring Carolyn home to her home state, and she remains buried in Williams, Arizona. But in Sharon's case, I was so happy to learn that despite so many years passing, the family wanted to bring her home to rest beside her mother, who had missed her so much for so many years. I can only hope that one day Sharon's killers will be identified, but since so many years have passed, I doubt justice will be served, as if her killers are still alive, they're in their mid-90s now. However, I am so grateful that genetic genealogy has solved yet another case and returned the proper name to a former Jane Doe. Thank you so much for listening to Across State Lines, and we will be back next week to dive into another unsolved case. Please follow or subscribe to Across State Lines on your podcast listening platform, so that way new episodes will drop directly into your listening feed. If you'd like to rate or review Across State Lines on whatever platform you listen to, it would be greatly appreciated. Thank you so much, and join us again next week.